I think you've hit on a really important point there, that it's not necessarily that you need to what your market is, because it will probably change, but you need to know who your market target is now, that you need to know what is it that you are focused on at the moment. Who is your target at the moment? Because that's going to define a lot of your technical strategy. That if you're doing a lot of technical work without understanding who your market is to begin with, you run the risk of developing just a beautiful technical solution to a problem that no one has.
Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. I'm your host, David Brühlmann, and today we are diving deep into the world of biomanufacturing with James Ryall, who is a strategic consultant with over 2 decades of experience in cell biology and regenerative medicine. From academia to industry and now consulting, James has seen it all. Get ready for some game-changing insights on scaling biotech innovations and navigating the complex landscape of bringing revolutionary products to market. Let's jump right in. Are you juggling the complexities of CMC development while trying to enjoy the beauty of biotech? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to simplify bioprocessing? Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast, where we're diving headfirst into the very challenges you face. We're breaking it down, demystifying the jargon, and giving you the keys to unlock your full potential. I'm your host, David Brühlmann, and I get it. With 15 plus years in the biotech industry, I face the same challenges you do. There's a way to simplify and streamline so you can remove complexity, you can skip trials and errors, deliver without delay your groundbreaking therapy to clinics and market, and still enjoy every single step. Do you want to learn how industry experts and I did it? Grab a cup of coffee and your favorite notebook and pen. Now is the time to take your bioprocessing game to the next level. Let's smarten up biotech. Welcome, James. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's great to be here, David, and thanks so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. James, share something that you believe about bioprocess development that most people disagree with.
Yeah, I don't know whether most people would disagree with this, but I think what I'll say is we can do it better. We can do it much better. We can do it with better cells, we can do it with better media, and we can do it with better hardware and software. The price economics of biomanufacturing and non-clinical biomanufacturing demand the economics get better. So not only do I think we can do better, I think that we need to do better across the board in terms of biomanufacturing. Hopefully most people actually agree with me.
Yeah, definitely. There is room for improvement, and we're going to talk about innovations and startups in a minute. But before we do that, can you paint us a picture of your professional journey that brought you to doing the work that you're doing today? And what were some interesting pit stops along the way?
Yeah, definitely. So look, I really started off my journey after my undergraduate degree. I did a PhD at the University of Melbourne. My PhD was focused on age-related muscle wasting and weakness. I had this real interest in skeletal muscle as a tissue. As a budding, I'm not going to say athlete, but as someone who was always very active, I was always interested as skeletal muscle as a tissue, but also concerned by what happens to that tissue as we get older. So my PhD was focused on ways to treat this age-related muscle wasting and weakness, and I became really, really intimately familiar with all of the molecular pathways that regulate skeletal muscle size and strength and how they go wrong with the traditional aging process. And after I finished my PhD, I spent a little bit of time still at the University of Melbourne starting to focus more on regenerative medicine. And so I was interested to not just look at age-related muscle wasting and weakness, but damage and repair cycles to skeletal muscle as a tissue. That kind of led me down a rabbit hole, and eventually I came across the name of Vittorio Sartorelli at the National Institutes of Health in the US. And we got to chatting about some of the work that he was doing over there on stem cells and whole transcriptomics. And I ended up moving to the US, and I spent 5 years working with Vittorio on characterizing not just the transcriptome of muscle stem cells, but also thinking about how the metabolic environment can regulate muscle stem cells. And we were really interested in understanding how muscle stem cells, the fate of those cells and the growth of those cells can be regulated based on the environment that they exist in. So after 5 years of working on that with Vittorio, I came back to Australia and started my own research group back at the University of Melbourne again, continuing a lot of that research around skeletal muscle stem cells and cell fate and metabolism. That was probably my first step into the media development and optimizing media formulations to grow muscle that stem cells at a reasonably, well, what I thought at the time was a reasonably large volume, that 100 mils at a time. It was during that time I was doing some research and looking at my cells down a microscope, and I realized that not only did the cells that I was growing have application for regenerative medicine, I was basically growing meat in a dish. That was really interesting to me, this idea that I was growing skeletal muscle, which is meat, and I was growing a tiny little steak in a dish. And so that was when I first started coming across this idea of cultured or cultivated meat. And of course, the first burger was made in 2013 by Mark Post. But companies were really beginning to pop up around the world focused on growing muscle and growing muscle at a really large scale to produce food, and to produce food in a way that didn't involve growing the entire animal itself. And so in 2019, I was doing a lot of podcasts and radio interviews talking a lot about the Beyond Meat IPO that was happening, which was plant-based. But I was also doing a lot of talk about cell-based meats as well. And that was really how Tim and George, the co-founders of Vow, came across my name. There was a period of time where if you did a search for cultured meat in Australia, mine was the only name that came up because I was the only one in Australia talking about it. And so Tim and George approached me and said that they were interested in starting a cultured meat company. And I said I was super excited and really wanted to help as much as I could, but I wasn't ready to leave my academic role that I'd spent the previous 20 odd years building this academic career. And so for the next 6 or 7 months, I spent a lot of time just providing help and guidance around cell types and media formulations and how to grow the cells that they were looking for. And it was after one of those last sort of calls that George pulled me aside and said, look, what would it take to get you to leave Melbourne Uni and come and work with us at Vow? And I had to think about it, and I said to him, look, I want to know that if I was to join Vow, I'd have the opportunity to work in a lab that analyze cells and do good science. I'd have the opportunity to do good science. And it was probably a week later, George got back to me and said, yeah, I think we can do that. And so they flew me up to Sydney. I had a look at what they were doing. 6 weeks later, I joined Vow as chief scientist. That was the start of my journey into biomanufacturing. I spent 4 years with Vow, cultured meat company, currently one of only 2 companies actively selling cultured meat to consumers. But you can go to Singapore today and buy the cultured meat product that we worked on for those 4 years, which is pretty incredible that we've got a biomanufactured food product on market. Happy to go into detail about Vow, but I think the most exciting thing for me was growing these cells that I'd spent 20 years of my career working on and growing them at a scale that was it blew my mind. We were pulling out kilograms of cells at a time. That whereas in the past, I'd been growing that it would take me weeks to get millions of cells. And we were growing billions and then trillions of cells. It's that scale that you only get when you move out into industry. And I think for me, that was one of the most exciting aspects of moving into industry out of academia.
What a fascinating story and career path you have. And now, after seeing so many things, academia and also the amazing potential you have in the industry, as you just highlighted, you have now moved into a different area. You've moved into consulting. What inspired this move, and what are the challenges you have faced in this new role?
Look, it's a really, really good question. In terms of inspiration, a key thing for me was after I wrapped up at Val, and after taking a couple of months off completely to just regroup and recover from an intense couple of years in an incredible startup, what I wanted to do with my career was continue to work with incredible teams of people and work on incredible technologies that have the ability to change the world for the better. While we're facing some of the biggest potential problems and issues of our time, I also think as a species that we are the smartest and most advanced and the most knowledgeable that we've ever been in the history of our species as well. And I truly believe we have the capacity to change the world for the better and change the trajectory that we're on for the better as well. And I want to make sure that I can play a role and help the companies in that space. So for me, consulting is the opportunity to work with a broad array of incredible founders and teams and helping them avoid so many of the mistakes and challenges that I faced early on, and really giving people almost like the cheat code to getting ahead faster. So everything I do is really focused about helping companies accelerate, avoid mistakes where they can, and making sure that everyone on that team is aligned towards a singular goal that is the right goal.
So let's make this very practical, James. Can you explain your process? How do you help biotech founders specifically? And how does this work? Once you onboard your client, what are the different steps you take?
I work with companies that are sort of pre-seed to Series B. That's sort of the space that I operate in. And I try to focus almost all of my work with companies that are using biomanufacturing to produce a non-clinical based product. Companies come to me for a range of different reasons, but the space that I'm finding that I'm getting the most or delivering the most value for them is making sure that clients can align their technical strategy with some sort of very clear commercial outcome, with the desire of working with me to shorten that timeline to the commercial outcome. Even before I onboard a client, that when I have that first conversation with a new potential client, so much of it is just about asking the question that tell me about your target market and tell me about your unique value proposition. Those two questions, they seem really, really easy to answer. And at the surface, they absolutely are. But when you start diving a little bit deeper than just that superficial layer, those two questions are so fundamental to the potential success of the company. I actually think that one of my biggest learnings as a consultant has been turning a lot of my own advice on myself. And so I can tell you that one of my first calls working as a consultant with a new client, not someone who had been referred to me, we jumped on a call. I told the client all about my background and my skills and my expertise. And he said, "That's fantastic, James. Your expertise is awesome and really well articulated. And clearly you've got some fantastic skills. Now tell me about how you work with companies and the value that you add." It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, David. I didn't have a really good answer to that question. I hadn't sort of thought about my own unique value proposition. And so I wasn't able to clearly articulate how I could work with this founder and the value that I could add to help this company. Distinctly remember getting off that call just thinking, oh no, I'm never going to hear from this person again. And fortunately, we followed up and we had some other conversations and we were able to get to a mutually beneficial outcome. From that, I took away just how important it was for me to be able to articulate my value proposition, that I work with pre-seed to Series B, and that I focus on the biomanufacturing space. And I am absolutely all about aligning technical and commercial to accelerate go-to-market. That is what I deliver. I've worked with companies now multiple times to identify new target opportunities and new market opportunities, allowing company-wide pivots. That one of the companies that we worked with recently, we did a deep dive into the market that they thought they wanted to target. And it turned out that that market was much, much, much smaller than they thought it was. But we ended up saving the company about 6 months of work, and they pivoted to a completely different market, which they're now beginning to launch into, which is amazing to see. But it's that idea about working with companies to avoid some of the pitfalls and mistakes that they make early on.
Yeah, smart biotech scientists, this is key. You need to be able to clearly articulate what you're selling. And whether you want to be a salesperson or not, as a scientist, you are selling all the time. Even if you're not a consultant, even if you are a researcher in the lab, you have to sell your idea to your peers, to your boss, to your investors. Thank you so much, James, for making this point. It's so key to be able to know the value you're bringing to the table.
I was going to say, David, I'd ask the same question for you. That when you think about working with your clients, because often we go into a discussion with a client, they're aiming to listen to them and to listen to the problems and challenges that they face, and then being able to articulate how we might be able to help and add value. But on a cold call, what's your unique value proposition? How do you sell yourself, David?
That's a very good point, James, because this is my very learning as a consultant, because a bit like you, when I started out, it was way too vague. It was too broad. It was kind of, I help you develop your process, which is nice. But what does this really mean? Are you working on the technical side? Are you working on the regulatory side? Or what does this mean? And so I boiled it down to something much more specific now. I help biotech leaders of small and mid-sized companies transform their technology and product into a commercially viable product. So that's much more concrete. It tells who I'm working with, who's my target audience. So it's biotech leaders of small and sometimes mid-sized companies. And then what are we achieving? What is the outcome and how are we doing that? I would say it's still today work in progress. Probably if we're having this conversation in 6 months, I might telling a slightly different version of it, because as I'm having more and more conversation with my target audience, I better understand actually the language I should be using. And this is also the point you mentioned. What is the clear value proposition, or what's the market? What I see also consulting startup companies, it's not always that easy to know that from the very beginning, because you have an innovative product and it probably sometimes, or no, I would say sometimes it takes several iterations until you're completely sure who your target audience is and what your exact value proposition is.
I think you've hit on a really important point there, that it's not necessarily that you need to what your market is, because it will probably change. But you need to know who your market target is now. That you need to know what is it that you are focused on at the moment. Who is your target at the moment? Because that's going to define a lot of your technical strategy. That if you're doing a lot of technical work without understanding who your market is to begin with, you run the risk of developing just a beautiful technical solution to a problem that no one has. That's a real risk that I see with a lot of the companies that I work with, especially technical founders that I think are amazing on the technical side of things. And they develop incredible technologies and they build beautiful teams. But the challenge is making sure that they spend the time diving into the commercial side of things as well. And the other point about the iterative cycle of value propositions, absolutely. My value proposition sort of changes every month or two. But I think that's one of the things about consulting, is that it's the ultimate personal development journey, that you, from every single engagement that you do, you get better. You get better with every single engagement that you complete. And so the personal growth that you undergo is phenomenal.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the personal growth is phenomenal. And something I've recently changed in my pitch is I'm not telling people anymore that I'm a consultant, which sometimes is a bit vague. I now change the narrative to telling people now I'm a fractional CTO, because people better understand what a CTO or a CSO does, and fractional is also quite understandable. And I found that this term is a better way to communicate actually what I'm doing. And I love that you also added this term now on your LinkedIn profile, which tells me also that it seems to work. There seems to be something with that. And you are also saying that you're a fractional CSO/CTO. So what is your approach actually in building your consultancy?
The fractional stuff is something sort of new to me in terms of what I'm doing and what I'm offering with the companies. Fractional CSO, CTO, I see, and the title doesn't really matter to me. What matters is the intent of what bringing me in would be. And typically it's a day a week or a day a fortnight. And the goal is for me to come in and basically work myself out of a job over the next 2 to 3 months. I want to come in, set up that frameworks and set up solutions, which can then be taken over by the team that I'm working with. And then I can have regular touch points every 3 or 6 months down the track. In terms of how that works, what I'm finding, and again, this remains a work in progress. It's by no means that this is the way I do it and this is the way it works. But what I find is the best thing to do is to go in and listen. I often get brought in for a particular problem or a particular challenge, and I come in and spend time talking with the teams and the managers and the mentors. And the problem that I was brought in to solve is not ultimately the problem blocking or slowing the team down, but there might be other reasons why the team is not performing at the level that the manager or the founder or the CEO is hoping for. And I've found that on more than one occasion now. And so it really just comes down to listening and, looking for fundamentally what is the challenge that this team is facing and what is slowing down the ability of this team to operate. A lot of time it comes down to ownership and accountability. That teams that don't have a high level of ownership that can often struggle to move as quickly and as in an agile manner. And that, I think, is fundamentally the way I work. I work on a foundation of trust and transparency, and I look to build teams that rely on high ownership and accountability. That seems to continue to work.
And that wraps up the first half of our fascinating conversation with James Ryall. We have covered everything from the challenges of transitioning to consulting to the common pitfalls in scaling biotech startups. Stay tuned for part 2 that will drop this Thursday, where we'll explore emerging sectors and game-changing innovations. And how did you like today's episode? Please tell us by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, because your review means the world to me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you on Thursday. All right, smart scientists. That's all for today on the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on your journey to bioprocess mastery. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, we can empower more scientists like you. For additional bioprocessing tips, visit us at smartbiotechscientist.com. Stay tuned for more inspiring biotech insights in our next episode. Until then, let's continue to smarten up biotech.